My name is Father Charlie Bouchard. I'm a Dominican friar who lives in St. Louis, Missouri. This weekend, we will be celebrating the 4th of July, an annual celebration in which we remember our country's independence and its heritage, and as we look to the future and hope. But this year's celebration isn't going to be nearly as happy or celebratory as those have been in past years. And that's because of the COVID virus. It's because of the racial tension and violence that we've experienced in the last few weeks. And it's also because of the economic crisis, which these two things, especially the virus, have caused. The first reading today from the prophet Zechariah articulates the deepest needs of our hearts when it says that one day chariots and bows will be banned and there will be peace for all the nations. Now, today we wouldn't probably talk about chariots and bows. We'd rather talk about bombs and tanks and guns being banned. But regardless what weapons we're talking about, the human longing for peace is the same. We today, like people in the time of Zechariah, want to rejoice heartily, as he says, but it is not possible, at least right now, for us to do so. As someone said recently, the undisguised brutality of our time weighs upon us. I think that's very accurate. The undisguised brutality of our time weighs upon us. The undisguised brutality could be that of the COVID virus, which is taking both the old and the young away from us, locking us into isolation, ravaging our economy. Or it could be the more literal, but also undisguised brutality of racial violence and murder of our citizens by the police. I recently came across this passage. It says, "We know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but we also know that we will remain inconsolable and that we will never find a substitute for what we have lost. No matter what may come to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it remains something else. And that is how it should be. The only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon." Now, these words could have been written today, but in fact, they were written in 1918 by Sigmund Freud after the loss of his niece Sophie to the pandemic that was ravaging the world at that time. And how poignantly they echo the pain of so many thousands of families today who have lost somebody dear and important and who are struggling to fill that place of emptiness, which in the end can never be filled. But the same words could also have been written by the families of George Floyd or of Eric Garner or of Tamir Rice in Cleveland. In a way, the losses of these families are even worse than deaths from the COVID virus because they are the result of violence, of poverty, and of misconduct by the police who are supposed to protect us. And of course, underlying much of that is also the idea of racial hatred and strife. And the hurt doesn't stop there. The violence that we are experiencing has hurt all of us, black and white alike. It has caused a wound which now, perhaps, we are just beginning to try to heal. I was struck today by the second reading, which urges us to live in the spirit rather than the flesh. And yet today, flesh is what it's all about. The feverish flesh of the COVID victim, fresh flesh struggling to breathe, black flesh beaten and bruised, white flesh flushed with anger and rage, and I hope also perhaps with embarrassment and shame. Our fleshly lives are what are on the line today. But you know, the funny thing is, in order to save our flesh, as St. Paul tells us, we must cultivate the spirit. It is the spirit of love, of hope, of faith, of compassion, and especially the spirit of listening that is our challenge today. As a white man, I have become more and more aware in the last few weeks that I have not done a very good job of listening. I am convinced that much of the injustice and inequity we experience is because certain people, especially those who have some power and privilege, have not been listening. They didn't listen because they didn't think they had to. They thought they knew everything they needed to know, and that their own experience is all that was important. And I don't mean here people only of great power and great privilege, those who were born with much and got even more because of incredible educational opportunities, family ties, and open doors. I mean even those of us, including me, who did not grow up with much, who had little or no family background or higher education or professional life in my history, but I did have at least one important door open to me, which then enabled me and others to find some success, some power, and some influence. But we're aware today, if we listen, that there are many others who didn't even have that one door open for them, and who now respond in anger and grief and depression that they have been unable to realize their human potential. So perhaps as we celebrate this 4th of July, we could commit ourselves to listening to each other. Not just in general, but perhaps commit ourselves to finding someone very unlike us, someone who is racially, economically, or socially distant or different, and try to engage in an honest conversation about our lives, our hopes, our disappointments, and our hurts. Perhaps in that shared vulnerability, we can find enough common ground to really move ahead and make a difference in our society this time. And as we celebrate the Eucharist this weekend and every weekend from here on out, let us offer those conversations, that listening that we've engaged in, to God. And let us pray for his promised peace and for the opportunity, as Zechariah says, to once again rejoice heartily together as one people of God.